Let's talk about Bitcoin. I did want to talk about the long-term debt cycle, but I might save that to the end because essentially we're getting Bitcoin at the end of a long-term debt cycle. But with Bitcoin itself, when you were working on the book, how much did you look at the previous technologies where people attempted to try things similar to Bitcoin? And how did you kind of see that as becoming the jigsaw puzzle that Satoshi pulled together?
So for years, even before the book, I've looked into this quite a bit. I did, obviously another round of research for the book, and it was you start with just Satoshi sources and work back from there. Also, Nakamoto Institute is a really good library of information. There's a bunch of these places online that you can find these big stockpiles of information. And what you see when you look through that is it wasn't, Bitcoin is often to outsiders looks like this thing that came out of nowhere. It's either a miracle or it's a scam, depending on their view of it, that just came out of nowhere. Whereas when you look at it, it's actually just one further innovation. It just so happens it's the piece that finally made it work, right? So technology often comes in stepwise changes. We think of it as like this like gradual improvement up, but usually it's like you get nowhere, you get nowhere, you get nowhere, you get nowhere, and then you have some key innovation. The discovery of electricity, the invention of the semiconductor. Michael Saylor has used the analogy before that humans couldn't do anything with flight for a very long time, but when we finally got hydrocarbons and aluminum, from in like a little over 50 years, you go from Wright brothers to the moon because you finally had the right pieces. And what Satoshi did is a lot of the pieces leading up to that were even in the early 80s there was research by Chaum and others, basically trying to figure out how to maintain a ledger or a database between mutually untrusting parties. And you had various growth in different types of encryption. Though throughout the 80s and 90s, that was a really big deal. And then you had the invention of proof of work by Adam Back, and then you had the concept of digital scarcity. And Satoshi's major contribution to this already multi-decade history was to say, well, how can we further decentralize it? Because a lot of the big problems was they could make a scarce unit, they could make this really cool ledger, but they couldn't quite decentralize it. And so the combination of the difficulty adjustment with proof of work, that's kind of Satoshi's major contribution to this whole thing, as well as just thinking through the details of how to make it work. Like he had to choose the block size and all that was partially based on bandwidth considerations and stuff like that. Like what is the rough math that can make this work on a reasonably distributed scale? And so basically when you look at the full story of Bitcoin, you see these like roughly 40 years of development ahead of it until it finally kind of really comes together in something that truly reaches what has so far been a pretty significant scale.
Yeah, I'd add one more thing in that I think Satoshi did that was clever and very important, which was disappearing. I still can't understand how he managed to do this I say him, but managed to do this anonymously and disappear. I think it's incredible because most secrets end up being found out. But I think the disappearing and leaving it to a community forced the decentralization further.
I agree. And it's hard to know how intentional that was. Like, some of it was he seemed to have been spooked. And so whether that was like a grand decision all along and he used that as an excuse, or if, it's hard to say what went through his mind when that happened, but either intentionally or accidentally, the fact that he did that was amazing. And then of course, the fact that he never spent the coins, whether he died, whether he burnt the private keys or whether he's still holding them and just had the discipline never to touch them. And it's possible he reemerged in the industry as himself, right? And wanted to keep working on it, but as himself. And there's like this, he wants to be Bruce Wayne now, not Batman anymore. And that's so. I think that's actually one of his most amazing things is that he was careful enough not to get formally doxxed. So people have different theories about who it might have been with different degrees of evidence, but there's no kind of like slam dunk case for who Satoshi is out there because he was careful enough, at least with these past 15 years of no one being able to formally figure it out.
If we've got no coiners who've listened to part 1 and 2 and got them here all to part 3, one of the interesting things is trying to explain to people the pillars of Bitcoin that make it so important. It's really hard trying to get people who don't want to know about Bitcoin to really care. I've tried again and again, and some people just aren't receptive of it. But when I do, there are these particular pillars that I try and discuss, and you've covered these in different ways in your book. But I try and talk about the monetary policy and why that's important. That Bitcoin is permissionless and censorship resistant, and again, why that's important and giving use cases. I try and talk about the scope of decentralization, and then more recently, I add in self-custody, and and I often tag on multi-sig with that. Let's work through these. Explain to me. I'm especially interested with you as a macro thinker, what you think of the monetary policy and why you think it's so important. For me, it's just I love the fact that it's a monetary policy with two rules: fixed limit 21 million, and an issuance rates that halves. Yeah, every, I can't remember, was it 280,000 blocks? It's every 4 years anyway. No, 210,000 blocks, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's the monetary policy. If you try and think of the monetary policy of the Bank of England, or any other central bank or any government, you've got hundreds, thousands of rules and caveats. Here we have is a policy with two rules. But you as a macro thinker, can you explain what it is and what you think of it?
I think I would separate it into two parts. One is the obvious and one is the subtle. So the obvious is the one that people in developing countries see more readily than people in developed countries. So if you have a good enough currency, good enough payment systems, you might think, why do we need Bitcoin? This is something you see quite often. Whereas if you live in a highly inflationary regime, if you live in an authoritarian regime, if your currency is just not accepted anywhere internationally and you're constantly dealing with cross-border frictions, if you'd like to move around, if you're a refugee and you want to be able to bring wealth with you, or you foresee in the future that you might be in a case where you have to bring wealth with you, and therefore you have a tool that you might want to get into in advance. These types of the permissionlessness, the resistance to debasement, are more obvious to people in less privileged monetary environments. And so when you tell someone, hey, there's this global ledger, this like decentralized cloud of money, and you can bring your money anywhere in the world, you can send your money to anyone in the world. It's very, unless someone can capture over 50% of the hash rate on a sustained basis, it's very hard for anyone to do anything about it. That's kind of the obvious things that Bitcoin solves, and it does it in this oddly simple way of what you pointed out: two rules basically for how the monetary policy operates, and then a handful of rules for how censorship could happen, or mostly is very resistant to happening. The more subtle complexities of why Bitcoin's important, even in developed countries, those are the more challenging ones to explain. And actually, that's why I think the Matrix analogy is such a good one. Matrix memes have been very popular in the Bitcoin community because when you're totally immersed in a system, it's very hard to see the system because the system's all around you. And so that gets to my other points around if the source of money creation is highly flexible, and if the logistics of money creation are easier to give to well-connected people, it's going to go to well-connected people. So even when intentions are good, money still tends to go to well-connected people. And then, of course, if intentions are corrupt or bad, it'll flow to well-connected people even more aggressively. And so what you see, for example, is when during the 2008 financial crisis, it was much easier to bail out the top 25 banks and give them access to inexpensive credit and some capital assistance during an emergency than to bail out millions of different homeowners, right? And so they do this top-down style of bailout. Banks are better off than homeowners, and that's why you get a lot of growing populism, growing discontent, Occupy Wall Street, Tea Party. You get all these different responses to that. And then even during the 2020 pandemic and all that, they tried in some ways to do a more bottom-up type of bailout. So, okay, this time we're going to do stimulus checks, we're going to do child care tax credits, we're going to do all that. But at the same time, when they did, credit seized up, right? So when that whole, all that stuff happens, everything gets locked down, financial markets break, credit freezes. So what do? Well, the Fed goes and buys corporate bonds. They literally buy bond ETFs. And what that does is, with a flick of a button, they can unfreeze the entire bond market, which large corporations use to raise capital. But then the question is, what about all those millions of small businesses that rely on tiny individual banks to serve as their line of credit? How do you get them all to open up? That's a far more distributed, decentralized system that's further away from the source of money creation. The logistics of dealing with it are much harder, right? So corporations got credit assistance and unfreezing of credit markets faster than small businesses did. And that's number one. And then when they tried to actually address that, they said, okay, let's do the PPP program. We'll give money to small businesses to help cover their employees. And that sounds like a good idea. And of course, it did save a number of important small businesses. But when you actually run the numbers, there's been studies on this, something like 2/3 of the benefits went to like the top 20% of the population. So a lot of times there were like law firms which were not impacted by COVID, and they said, yeah, we have 30 employees, we're gonna have to lay them off if we don't get money. And then they get money, and then they never had to lay anyone off anyway. So the $500,000 they got just goes to the three people who run the law firm. They're already wealthy. So it's like person A gets like 3,000 in stimulus benefits and some child tax credits, whereas like these people each got six figures, right? And so when you look at that kind of distribution, it's either intentionally or unintentionally, sometimes a combination of both. It's always easier in this kind of flexible monetary environment to channel more and more money to the top.